Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. In this episode, we're going to celebrate the launch of the new Flames of War book, Bagration Axis Allies, with a custom terrain build. When Battlefront released their West German book last month, I was really excited to participate by doing some terrain builds. And they must have really liked it because here we are repeating it again. So I'm very fortunate to be able to do another series of articles, in this case two, to celebrate the launch of the Bagration Axis Allies. This video series will follow a similar format to the previous one in that I'm going to be using some of the excellent terrain that is produced by Battlefront Miniatures, and I'm going to soup it up to enhance its visual interest and give it the proper vibe for the battlefield. We're going to work with one-horse carts to provide a sense of scale, and we're going to work with the really excellent kit, the Ruined Church. In the next episode, we're going to build something from scratch, and we're going to build a graveyard, maybe a spooky one, to go with the church. So, with all that covered, let's get to building.
As always, I start by drawing out a quick plan, which I transfer onto a fresh sheet of cardboard, and then I move on to building the base. I decided I wanted the base for the church to be about 26 centimeters wide by about 25 centimeters deep. I have some roads I had built previously, and I wanted them to butt up against the front. So I left a portion that was 6.5 centimeters wide at the front that was flat where the road sections could meet the church. At the back of the church, I decided to leave a flat edge as well, so the graveyard could be placed there. Tracing out the location of the church on the base, I then grabbed a knife and cut it all out according to my plans. Because I wanted to have cobblestones at the front of the church, I cut an additional layer of cardboard and hot glued it down to the front. The base was starting to shape up really well, but I felt it needed some extra support to ensure that it was sturdy enough. So I took what I had made so far and laid it out on another piece of cardboard. I made sure the grain on the cardboard was at right angle between the different levels. Then I traced out the upper layer, but left a lip around the edge to make it about 1 centimeter wide. Then I went in and cut this out. Taking the top layer and the bottom layer, I now hot glued them together. The area I had planned for the cobblestones now needed some texture, so I ruled off a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter grid and went and scored the cobblestones into the top using my pen. After that was done, I grabbed some cardboard cutoffs and hot glued them to the surface, framing either side of the cobblestones. This would provide a curb. Finally, I could finish the base itself by ringing the outside with a layer of good quality masking tape. This would smooth off the gradient between the lips at the edge of the base and also seal off the grain at the end of the cardboard so it wasn't damaged if it came into contact with moisture when I add paint and glue later. Now I could move on to the church, and this model is really excellent, just straight out of the box, and I didn't need to repaint it, which made me pretty happy. So I started working on it just by touching it up a bit. I took some deck tan and ivory paint, and I went over the model with a light dry brush, mainly focusing on the edges, so it built in an extra highlight. After that, I got out some Hull Red, and I picked out a few specific tiles and some brickwork and made it sort of a dark red. I also added some deck tan to this and went back over it to give it a highlight to help them stand out. I worked on the wood by painting it mud brown, highlighted it with dark sand, and wash that down with Army Painter Soft Tone. Switching to the interior of the church, I took some stiff bristle brushes, heavily layered on some mud brown paint and some German gray, which is a very dark gray, and just went ahead and run my fingers along the bristles, splattering random specks all around the inside. This created the impression of damage. After this was dry, I took out both Army Painter Strong Tone and Soft Tone, and I highly recommend these products. They're great for so many different uses. And I took the dark tone, ran it into the edges and along the floor, and then shaded the rest of the walls by blending the soft tone into the dark tone and working it higher up towards the top where there would be more light. As often happens, the dry brushing toned down some of the contrast in the model, so I got out some black and brown enamel washes and went back after thinning them heavily and ran them into the dark areas, the crevices, anywhere that needed a little more shadow. At this point I decided that the church was looking pretty good, but it was still looking a little too new. So I got out some dark brown oil paint and I went in and painted it into patches and strips all over the model. Taking out some thinner, I then went back and worked these into the stonework itself to imply smudges and stains. At this point I was satisfied with the church, so I decided to glue it down to the base. I flipped it over and painted the bottom of it heavily with some Mod Podge. Then I pushed it down securely on the top and left it to dry overnight. Once the glue on the building was dry, I went ahead to start work on the little details. I got out my usual mixture of matchsticks, small cut-off pieces of balsa wood, spare chunks of insulation foam, and some small extra pieces from various sprues, and set them out. I also went and got out some crushed glass. You get this from IKEA. It's decorative for going inside planters, but it's got a very squared off crystalline structure that makes a pretty convincing smashed brick. I poured these out and came up with an idea of where I was going to place them on the model. Then I cut off some small wedges of foam and glued them into place between the window frames. I wanted to create the impression that there were piles of rubble here. Once I had done that, I got out some Mod Podge, spread it with a paintbrush, and began gluing down the pieces in various spots. I wanted to create the idea that there was a lot of rubble and larger broken pieces around. After letting the glue dry for about 10 minutes, I go back, pour out some more Mod Podge, and mix it heavily with black acrylic paint. This just helps give a base layer for the undercoat. Then I spread it thickly over the base and sprinkle it with a mixture of about 80% sandbox sand to about 20% kitty litter. This will apply a really good foundation of grit to the base and create the impression of having lots and lots of rubble. To make sure I get a rock-solid bond on my grit, I decide to use the rubbing alcohol technique. I pour out some rubbing alcohol in a little dish, I add some black acrylic ink to it, and then I apply it over top of the grit using a pipette. I want to do this while the underlying glue is still wet. Then, immediately afterwards, I come along with some more watered down Mod Podge, and I place that using the pipette over top. The rubbing alcohol breaks the surface tension in the glue and helps it flow and coat the grit more thoroughly. After all this is done, I leave this overnight to dry. This is a good point to move on to the one-horse cart. So I build it according to the instructions, give it a quick prime, and then go ahead and paint it. I paint the cart in dark browns, and I highlight it with dark sand. I paint the horse in colors that are moving from a dark beige up to a lighter white color. After this is all done, I give the horse a coating of Army Painter Soft Tone and the cart a coating of Army Painter Strong Tone. It's now the next day, and all of the glue on the grit has dried, so I'm ready to start painting. The first thing I need to do is finish my undercoat. This isn't going to be very easy to spray paint, since it would be hard to mask off the entire church, so instead I take out some black acrylic paint and paint it on by hand. Having already put the foundation layer down by mixing the paint into the Mod Podge makes this a lot easier. After the black paint is dried, now I can start on the grit. I pour out some dark brown and dry brush it carefully over top of all the grit. Then I follow up with tan. After the tan had dried, I move on to the rocks and the larger pieces of rubble, first by dry brushing them a very dark gray. I also do the cobblestones at this time as well. Then I switch to a light gray and go back over the dark grays. And then, once this is dried, move on to an off-white. I apply this to all the grit and the cobblestones, and then follow up with a very, very light dry brush of white, which I apply to, again, all of the grit and the cobblestones. At this point, I go ahead and pick out any small details that I'd like, centering out a few specific pieces of rubble, some with red tones, others with different shades of gray or brown, and then I move on to any surface that is to be metal. I dry brush it with some metallic paint, and then go over top of it with some rust enamels. After the enamels have dried, I blend them out with white spirits. In my opinion, one of the best ways to weather concrete is to use dry pigments. So I get out some dark brown dirt colors and some dust color pigments, and using a dry, stiff bristle brush, I go ahead and work them into the cobblestones. I make sure to focus around the edges where dirt may have washed out of the grit onto the road surface. As frequently happens when working with a lot of dry brushing or with dry pigments, some of the definition has been covered up, so I get out my enamel dark wash. Again, this is just a black or dark brown enamel paint that's heavily thinned, and I go back and line in the edges of some of the more prominent debris and the cracks between the different cobblestones. This now brings me to landscaping. I start with static grass. I spread down some patches of Mod Podge here and there, and then taking out my static grass applicator, I put down a layer of yellow static grass. I always like to work with a couple colors, so I follow this up with a lighter green. Once the static grass has all been applied, I go ahead and glue down some lichens in various interesting spots. I've got some viney ones that I glued to the side of the building, and I install some little clumps of grass made from twine that I'd made for previous projects. To finish off the details, I now super glue the horse and cart into place and spread a little Mod Podge over the base and disguise it with some grit. When the glue is dry, I get out some matte varnish and go ahead and give the whole model a couple coats. This is to protect it from the inevitable wear and tear of being on display or being used as a game piece. Lastly, I get out some gloss varnish and I go in and paint in some little streams of water and accumulations of moisture in different spots on the base, just to establish some visual interest. And with that, the project is done. I think you'll agree that this build turned out really well. The ruined church by Battlefront provides such a nice subject. It has a lot of good relief and colors to it as it comes just straight out of the box. By enhancing it with a few other simple weathering tricks, it really helps the model pop. Also, the base adds some really interesting textures, and the landscape adds some color. The little details, such as the vines climbing the side of the building, or the discarded pieces of rubble and brick, really give the model a sense of time and place. Lastly, the addition of the horse cart adds a storyline to the piece, which elevates it from a piece of wargames terrain to an individual and unique piece of art. All in all, I think this project is very visually interesting and will fit in well with our growing spread that we're building to celebrate the launch of Bagration Axis Allies.
That's it for this episode. But don't worry, there's still more to come because we still have to cover the graveyard, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and please remember to subscribe if you haven't already done so. I appreciate all my viewers, and I've got a lot more exciting upcoming content. See you next time, and until then, remember to keep building life in miniature.